There seems to be a misunderstanding. This is my daughter's car. The battery died.
We received a call about a man attempting to steal this vehicle. A man matching your description.
What are you doing in this neighborhood dressed like that?
The Saturday morning light that filtered through the ancient oak trees of the Crestwood Hills subdivision was different. It was a soft, gilded light, as if strained through money, casting long, elegant shadows across lawns so perfectly manicured they looked like green velvet carpets. This was a world of quiet opulence, where the loudest sound was often the polite whir of an electric luxury vehicle gliding down the immaculate asphalt of Sycamore Lane. The houses were not merely homes, they were statements, sprawling brick Georgians and stone-faced Tudors set far back from the road, protected by discreet security systems and the unspoken but powerful barrier of extreme wealth. It was a community that prided itself on order, predictability, and a serene, exclusionary peace. Into this carefully curated tranquility, a disruption had arrived. It was not a loud party or a construction crew. It was something far more mundane, and therefore, in its own way, more unsettling to the neighborhood's rhythm. A stalled car. A deep burgundy Lincoln Navigator, usually a symbol of the very affluence the neighborhood embodied, sat stubbornly silent at the curb in front of one of the newer, more modern-styled homes. Its hood was propped open, a gaping metal mouth revealing the complex, silent machinery within. Standing before this inert machine was Samuel Jones. At 55, he was a man built on a foundation of solid, quiet confidence. His hair was cropped short, a distinguished salt and pepper that framed a face etched with the fine lines of both laughter and deep thought. He was dressed not for the Crestwood Hills social scene, but for work. A simple, dark blue mechanic's jumpsuit, clean but well-worn, covered his tall, broad-shouldered frame. His hands, which were currently probing the engine's interior, were large and capable, the hands of a man accustomed to solving problems. Beside him, her expression a mirror of his own patient frustration, was his daughter, Maya. At 28, she possessed her father's calm demeanor, but with a modern energy. She was a young architect, her keen eye for detail now focused on the bewildering array of wires and hoses. "I just don't get it, Dad," she said, leaning over the fender. "It was running perfectly fine yesterday. I went to start it this morning for my site visit and nothing, not even a click." Samuel grunted, a sound of thoughtful diagnosis rather than irritation. He pointed a finger towards the battery terminal. "See that corrosion? The white chalky stuff. That might be our culprit. The connection's probably shot. We'll need to clean it off and see if we can get a good enough contact to jump it." He straightened up, wiping a smudge of grease from his knuckle with a rag he pulled from his back pocket. "Go grab the keys to my truck. Let's see if we can bring this thing back to life." Maya nodded, a wave of relief washing over her. Her father had a way of making even the most daunting problems feel manageable. It was a skill he had honed over a lifetime. As she turned to walk up the long, sloping driveway towards the garage, Samuel leaned against the grill of the Navigator, his arms crossed. He surveyed the quiet street. A woman in expensive athletic wear jogged past on the opposite sidewalk, her gaze flicking towards him for a moment before quickly looking away, her pace seeming to quicken just slightly. A landscaping truck was parked 2 houses down, the low hum of a leaf blower the only sound breaking the silence. Everything was peaceful. Everything was in its place. He was just a father helping his daughter, a scene as old as time playing out on a sun-drenched Saturday morning. He had no way of knowing that in Crestwood Hills, some scenes were viewed through a very different lens, and that the quiet observers behind the pristine windows of Sycamore Lane were already beginning to write a very different story. "Okay, I've got them," Maya announced, her sneakers crunching softly on the crushed gravel of the driveway's edge as she returned. She dangled the keys to Samuel's Ford F-150, a practical, powerful vehicle that seemed more at home than the sleek, disabled Navigator. Samuel took the keys. "All right, let's get her positioned." He walked up the driveway, his worn work boots a stark contrast to the pristine, stamped concrete. He fired up the truck, its diesel engine rumbling to life with a comforting, throaty growl that felt alien in the hushed quiet of the neighborhood. He backed it carefully down the slope, maneuvering the large vehicle until its front grille was just a few feet from the navigators, like two beasts preparing for a ritual. The process was methodical, a familiar dance for anyone who had ever dealt with a dead battery. Samuel popped the truck's hood, grabbed the thick, coiled jumper cables from the passenger seat, and laid them out on the ground. He was a man who believed in process, in doing things the right way, step by step. First, he attached the red clamp to the positive terminal of the dead battery, the metal teeth biting through the white corrosion Maya had pointed out. He wiggled it, ensuring a solid connection. "It's really on there," Maya noted, watching his hands work. "That's the problem," Samuel explained without looking up, his voice calm and instructive. "A battery can have a full charge, but if that charge can't get to the starter because the connection is this bad, you've got a 2-ton paperweight." He stretched the cable across the gap, attaching the other red clamp to the positive terminal of his truck's powerful battery. Then came the black cable, first to the negative terminal on the truck, and finally he paused, holding the last clamp in his hand. "Now, we don't want to connect this directly to the negative terminal on the dead battery. It can create a spark, and battery fumes can be flammable. We'll ground it. Find a good, unpainted piece of metal on the engine block." He located a sturdy bolt on the navigator's frame, attaching the final clamp securely. The entire procedure was carried out with a quiet efficiency that spoke of years of experience. There was no wasted motion, no uncertainty. It was the work of a man who understood how things worked and how to fix them when they didn't. He let the truck run for a few minutes, allowing electricity to flow into the dormant battery of the SUV. "All right, give it a try," he called to Maya, stepping back. Maya slid into the driver's seat of the navigator, the plush leather sighing as she settled in. She turned the key in the ignition. The engine turned over with a slow, guttural groan, a reluctant R sound that died almost as soon as it began. It was a sound of protest, not life. "Nothing," she said, her shoulders slumping. "Don't worry," Samuel reassured her. "Sometimes it needs a little more juice, and we need a better connection." He walked back to the navigator's battery, pulled a wire brush from a toolkit in his truck bed, and began to vigorously scrub at the corroded terminal. The white powder flaked away, revealing the dull gray lead beneath. He worked with a focused intensity, his entire being concentrated on this one simple, frustrating task. He was a man in his own world, a bubble of fatherhood and mechanical troubleshooting. He was completely unaware that this bubble was being observed, that his focused intensity was being misinterpreted, and that the narrative of his morning was being rewritten from a distance by unseen eyes that had already decided what they were seeing. The engine's stubborn silence was nothing compared to the silence of the judgment being passed upon him. From the cool, climate-controlled interior of the house directly across the street, Chad and Brittany Caldwell had a perfect panoramic view of the scene unfolding on Sycamore Lane. Their living room window was a vast expanse of spotless glass, framing the world outside like a piece of art. And for them, the world was, in many ways, an art piece they had carefully curated. Their home was a monument to modern minimalism, all clean lines, white walls, and strategically placed designer furniture. It was a space designed to be calm, ordered, and above all, controlled. Chad stood by the window, a steaming ceramic mug of single-origin coffee in his hand. At 38, he had the lean, toned physique of a man who spent his mornings with a personal trainer and his afternoons closing deals. He wore a gray cashmere sweater and tailored joggers, an outfit of casual expense. He had worked hard to get to Crestwood Hills, to earn his place in this enclave of success, and he viewed the neighborhood not just as his home, but as a fortress to be guarded. "What is going on over there?" he murmured, more to himself than to Brittany. Brittany, 35, looked up from her tablet, where she had been scrolling through a high-end interior design blog. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a sleek, perfect ponytail, and she wore a matching set of silk pajamas. She walked over to join him, her brow furrowed with a delicate, practiced concern. "That's Maya's car, isn't it? The one her parents got her when she finished her master's? It is, Chad confirmed, his eyes narrowing. But who is that man? I've never seen him before. They watched as Samuel, dressed in his dark blue jumpsuit, moved with purpose between the two vehicles. They saw him scrubbing at the battery, his movements focused and efficient. But they did not see a father. Through the distorted lens of their own anxieties and preconceived notions, they saw an anomaly. They saw a large, unknown black man in work clothes, deeply engaged with an expensive luxury vehicle. The fact that the vehicle belonged to their neighbor Maya, whom they knew to be a young, successful black woman, did little to alter their perception. In their minds, the pieces didn't fit. The image clashed with the unwritten but rigidly enforced rules of their world. "He doesn't look like he belongs here," Brittany said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Look at what he's wearing. He looks, I don't know, like a mechanic maybe? But why would a mechanic be here on a Saturday morning with no company truck? And why is he so intent on that engine?" Chad added, the gears of suspicion turning faster in his mind. "It looks like he's trying to hotwire it or something. See how he's messing with the cables? And he's using his own truck. It's the perfect cover. Pull up like you're helping, but you're actually disabling the security or getting it ready to tow." This leap of logic was staggering, yet for them, it felt entirely plausible. They had built their fortress in Crestwood Hills to keep the dangers of the outside world at bay, and their definition of danger was often shaped by faces and circumstances that didn't match their own. Samuel's presence was a deviation from the norm, a disruption to the curated reality of Sycamore Lane. The fact that Maya was present was a detail they easily dismissed. In their rapidly forming narrative, she could be a lookout, or even a victim, too intimidated to say anything. "We should do something," Brittany said, a tremor of what she perceived as righteous fear in her voice. "We can't just stand here and watch him steal her car in broad daylight." Chad nodded slowly, a sense of self-importance swelling in his chest. He was a protector, a guardian of the neighborhood's sanctity. He placed his coffee mug down on a marble coaster. The view from their window was no longer just a scene, it was a call to action. And in their clean, ordered, and controlled world, they were absolutely certain they knew what that action had to be. The seed of suspicion, once planted in the fertile ground of Chad and Brittany's minds, began to sprout with alarming speed. It was no longer a question of what if, but a firm conviction of what is. "He's been out there for at least 20 minutes, Chad said, his voice now taking on the tone of a prosecutor laying out his case. He hadn't moved from the window, his posture rigid. "No tow truck has been called. No AAA. Just him and that old pickup truck. It feels wrong." Brittany, feeding off his certainty, took out her phone. "I'm going to text the neighborhood group chat." Her fingers flew across the screen, her message a carefully crafted piece of alarmism. "Hi, everyone. Is anyone else seeing what's happening at Maya's place on Sycamore? There's a strange man in a jumpsuit trying to get into her Navigator. He's got his own truck pulled up to it. Looks incredibly suspicious. We're getting concerned." Within seconds, the replies started to trickle in. A scene from David at the end of the cul-de-sac. A question mark from Susan 2 doors down. Then, a message from another neighbor, Mark, who lived 3 houses away. "I see him too. Walked my dog past there a little while ago. Definitely doesn't look like a resident. We need to be careful." This digital confirmation was all the validation they needed. Their personal prejudice was now laundered through the consensus of a small, like-minded group. It became a shared truth. The whisper had become a chorus. "See? Mark sees it too," Brittany said, holding up her phone as if it were concrete evidence. "We're not crazy. This is really happening." The fear, whether genuine or performative, now had a life of its own. It was a living entity in the room with them, demanding action. The possibility that there might be an innocent explanation, that the man could be a family member, a friend, a mechanic Maya had called herself, was never seriously entertained. To consider that would be to admit their initial judgment was flawed, and that was an admission Chad and Brittany were psychologically incapable of making. Their worldview depended on the accuracy of their instincts, especially when it came to identifying who did and did not belong. "I'm calling the police," Chad declared, his decision made. "This is exactly what the neighborhood watch is for. We see something, we say something." "Should we call Maya first?" Brittany asked, a fleeting moment of doubt crossing her mind. "Just to be sure?" Chad dismissed the idea with a wave of his hand. "And what if he's threatening her? What if he sees her on the phone and panics? No, we can't risk it. We call 911. Let the professionals handle it. That's what they're paid for. We'll be the good neighbors who saw a potential crime and reported it." He framed the act as a civic virtue, a brave stand for community safety. In reality, it was an abdication of personal responsibility, a way to outsource their confrontation to men with badges and guns. He picked up his phone, but Brittany gently took it from his hand. "Let me do it," she said, her voice steadying. "I'm better at this. I'll make sure they understand the urgency." There was a chilling certainty in her tone. She was preparing to give a performance, to shape a narrative that would guarantee the response she wanted. Chad watched, a look of grim approval on his face. From across the street, Samuel had finally managed to scrub the battery terminal clean. He reattached the red clamp, wiggling it to ensure the tightest possible connection. He was focused on circuits and currents, entirely oblivious to the fact that across the street, a whisper had become a formal accusation, and the forces of the law were about to be summoned based on a fiction he was unknowingly starring in. Brittany retreated from the window into the quiet sanctuary of their minimalist kitchen, the cold marble island pressing against her legs. She wanted a buffer of silence, a space where she could compose her thoughts and modulate her voice for maximum effect. She took a deep breath, like an actress preparing for a difficult scene, and dialed 911. The voice that answered was calm, professional, and female. 911, what is the address of your emergency? Hello? Yes, my address is 214 Sycamore Lane, in Crestwood Hills, Brittany began, her voice an octave higher than usual, laced with a carefully constructed panic. The emergency isn't here, it's across the street. At number 217. I think a car is being stolen, right now. Okay, ma'am, can you tell me exactly what you're seeing? The dispatcher asked, her tone even. There's a man, I've never seen him before, He's a black man, older, maybe in his 50s. He's wearing a blue jumpsuit, like a uniform. He's trying to break into a Lincoln Navigator, a burgundy one. He has his own old pickup truck pulled right up to it, blocking the view from the street. Every detail she offered was technically true, but stripped of its innocent context and reassembled into a portrait of criminality. The jumpsuit was no longer workwear. It was a disguise. The truck was not a tool for assistance, it was an accomplice's vehicle. Is the owner of the vehicle there? The dispatcher inquired. Yes, my neighbor Maya. She's there, Brittany said, her voice dropping conspiratorially. But she looks scared. She's just standing there watching him. He's being very aggressive. He's yelling. This was a complete fabrication. Sam's voice had not risen above a calm, conversational level, but Brittany knew this was the key. Aggression was a trigger word. It elevated the situation from a property crime to a potential hostage scenario. He's yelling at her? The dispatcher clarified, a new note of urgency in her voice. Yes, and he keeps messing with the engine. I think he might have a weapon. I can't see his hands clearly, but he's reaching for tools, and he just seems very agitated. I'm scared for her. I don't feel safe, even in my own home. The lie was now audacious, a dangerous escalation. She had taken a man helping his daughter and painted him as a dangerous, armed felon on the verge of violence. She was not just reporting a suspicion, she was setting a trap, ensuring that the responding officers would arrive not as investigators, but as warriors, heading into a high-threat situation. Their adrenaline would be pumping, their hands would be ready, their minds already convinced of the suspect's guilt and potential for danger. Okay, ma'am, we're dispatching officers to your location now, the dispatcher said, her voice now clipped and all business. Can you stay on the line with me? Do not approach him. "I won't, I'm hiding," Brittany whispered, crouching down behind the kitchen island for dramatic effect, even though no one could see her. "Please, just tell them to hurry. He looks like he could snap at any moment." She listened as the dispatcher relayed the information over the police radio. She could hear the crackle, the codes, the transmutation of her lies into official police business. Possible 211 in progress. Suspect is a black male adult, 50s, blue jumpsuit. Acting aggressively. Female on scene appears to be under duress. Suspect may be armed. A cold sense of power settled over Brittany. She had done it. She had taken the messy, unsettling anomaly from across the street and forced it into a narrative the system would understand. She had protected her home, her neighborhood, her carefully ordered world. She had no concept of the fire she had just started, or of the man whose life she had so casually and carelessly endangered. As she ended the call, she walked back to the window where Chad was still standing sentinel. "They're on their way," she said, her voice now calm, her duty done. "They're coming in hot." The response was everything Brittany could have hoped for. Less than 3 minutes after her call, the gilded silence of Sycamore Lane was shattered. The sound of a siren, initially a distant wail, grew rapidly into a piercing shriek that seemed to ricochet off the stately brick facades of the homes. A black and white police cruiser, its rooftop lights strobing in a frantic, dizzying rhythm of red and blue, swung onto the street. It didn't cruise, it descended, eating up the asphalt with an urgency that broadcasted extreme danger. The car didn't pull neatly to the curb. It cut the angle sharply, coming to a halt diagonally behind Samuel's F-150, effectively boxing both his truck and the Navigator in. The move was tactical, designed to block any potential escape route. The doors flew open before the vehicle had even fully settled, and 2 uniformed officers emerged, their movements swift and economical, honed by training and repetition. The senior officer, whose name tag read Reed, was a man in his late 30s with a thick neck and a face that seemed permanently fixed in a mask of weary cynicism. He had seen enough of the city to believe he could size up any situation in seconds, and his instincts were rarely troubled by doubt. His hand didn't go to his gun, but it hovered near his holstered firearm, a casual posture of readiness that radiated tension. His partner was younger, Officer Finch. He was barely out of his probationary period, and he moved with a taut, nervous energy, his eyes wide and constantly scanning. He mirrored Reed's stance, but with more rigidity, a student eager to prove he knew the protocols. He had heard the dispatch call, aggressive, possibly armed, female in distress, and his mind had already constructed a clear image of the suspect. When his eyes landed on Samuel Jones, a tall black man in a mechanic's jumpsuit, the image solidified into fact. The puzzle pieces, as delivered by dispatch, fit perfectly. "Police! Show me your hands!" Reed's voice was a sharp, commanding bark that cut through the morning air. It wasn't a request, it was a non-negotiable order. Samuel, who had been leaning back over the engine to give the battery a final check, straightened up abruptly. The sudden command, charged with adrenaline and hostility, was so jarring it felt like a physical blow. He turned slowly, his hands, one holding a wire brush and the other a rag, held up instinctively. He saw the 2 officers, their bodies angled towards him, their expressions grim and devoid of curiosity. He saw their cruiser, parked to block him in. In a fraction of a second, his experienced mind processed the tactical approach. This wasn't a check the welfare call, this was a felony response. Maya, who had been about to try the ignition again, froze in the driver's seat, her heart leaping into her throat. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Stay in the car, Maya, don't move," Samuel said, his own voice miraculously calm and steady, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just erupted. He made a conscious effort to relax his posture, to appear non-threatening, but he knew the stage had already been set by a playwright he couldn't see. "Drop what's in your hands, now!" Finch shouted, his voice cracking slightly with nervous energy. Samuel looked down at the harmless tools, the wire brush, the rag. He slowly bent his knees and placed them on the ground, then straightened up again, his empty hands raised to shoulder level, palms facing forward. He could feel the eyes of the neighborhood on him, curtains twitching, a door opening and quickly closing. The audience had gathered. From their window across the street, Chad and Brittany watched, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and vindication. Their call had been answered. The cavalry had arrived to slay the dragon they had imagined into existence. With the perceived weapons, the wire brush and rag, neutralized on the ground, Officer Reed advanced, his partner flanking him to the right, their movements a textbook example of tactical approach. They maintained a triangle with Samuel at the apex, a position designed to intimidate and control. "What's going on here?" Reed demanded, stopping about 15 feet away. His tone was not one of inquiry, it was one of accusation. He wasn't there to understand, he was there to confirm the report. "Good morning, officers," Samuel began, his voice a low, steady baritone that he intentionally kept even. "There seems to be a misunderstanding. This is my daughter's car. The battery died and I'm just helping her get it started." He gestured with his head towards Maya, who was still frozen in the driver's seat, her face pale. Reed's eyes flickered to Maya, then back to Samuel, his expression unchanged. The explanation, simple and logical, did nothing to penetrate the wall of suspicion built by the 911 call. "We received a call about a man attempting to steal this vehicle. A man matching your description," he stated flatly. "Said you were acting aggressively." "Aggressively?" Samuel repeated, a note of genuine disbelief in his voice. He could feel a slow burn of anger beginning deep within him, but he knew with the chilling certainty of a man who had seen how these encounters could go that he had to keep it ruthlessly suppressed. "Officers, I can assure you, nothing aggressive has happened here. We've just been trying to jumpstart the car." "He's being evasive," Finch chimed in, stepping forward slightly. He was directing his comment to Reed, but it was intended for Samuel to hear. "Doesn't want to answer the question." "What question was I asked?" Samuel replied, his gaze shifting to the younger officer. "I was told I matched a description. I'm explaining the reality of the situation." This calm, articulate pushback was not what the officers expected. They were used to fear or frantic denial. Samuel's composure was, in their view, suspicious. It was the calmness of someone who knew the system, a professional. "All right, let's see some ID," Reed commanded, ignoring Samuel's explanation entirely. "Both of you." "Of course," Samuel said. "Mine is in my back pocket. May I have your permission to reach for it slowly?" "Stay right where you are," Reed snapped. "Keep your hands up, we'll get to that." He turned his attention to Maya. "Ma'am, are you all right? Are you here of your own free will?" The question was so absurd that Maya stared at him for a moment in stunned silence. "Of course I'm all right," she finally managed to say, her voice shaky but indignant. "This is my father. He's helping me. Who called you? Who said we were doing anything wrong?" "We're not here to answer your questions, miss," Finch said sharply. "We're here to secure the scene." He then turned his focus back to Samuel, his eyes scanning the jumpsuit. "So this is your daughter, you say? What are you doing in this neighborhood dressed like that?" The question hung in the air, thick with insinuation. It had nothing to do with a stolen car. It was a challenge to his very presence. It was the verbal equivalent of a "you don't belong here" sign. "I'm dressed like this because I was working on my own car at home when my daughter called," Samuel said, his patience being stretched to its absolute limit. "I came directly here to help her. My profession and my clothing are not relevant to this." He was offering them a clear, simple path to de-escalation and truth, a path they seemed determined to avoid. They weren't conducting an investigation. They were running a script, and in their script, Samuel was the villain. Every calm denial, every logical explanation he offered was merely an attempt to deviate from a plot they had already decided upon. Across the street, Chad and Brittany watched with grim satisfaction. The officer's aggressive questioning validated their decision. They hadn't been prejudiced, they had been perceptive. They were the heroes of the story. The standoff was reaching a point of dangerous absurdity. Samuel stood with his hands raised, being interrogated about his choice of clothing, while the simple, verifiable truth sat waiting in the glove compartment of the vehicle at the center of the dispute. Maya, realizing that her father's patient logic was having no effect on the officers, decided she had to act. "My registration and ID are in the glove box," she announced from the driver's seat, her voice gaining strength from a surge of indignation. "The car is registered in my name. The address on my license is this house right here. This will clear everything up in 30 seconds. Officer Reed turned his cynical gaze towards her. "Ma'am, I need you to stay in the vehicle and not make any sudden moves." "It's not a sudden move to open a glove box," Maya shot back, her fear being rapidly replaced by anger at the injustice of the situation. "You're treating my father like a criminal, and all the proof you need that you're wrong is right here." Before Reed could respond, she leaned over, popped open the small compartment, and retrieved a small leather pouch containing the vehicle's documents and her wallet. She held them up. "See? Right here. May I please get out of the car and show them to you?" Reed hesitated. The situation was beginning to attract more attention. Another neighbor was now standing on their lawn, watching intently. The scene was becoming less controlled. The presence of irrefutable physical evidence was a complication to the officer's preferred narrative. To refuse to look at it would be a clear procedural failure. "All right," Reed conceded with a sigh of annoyance, as if being asked to do his job was a great inconvenience. "Step out of the car, slowly, and place the documents on the hood." Maya did exactly as he said, her movements deliberate. She got out, walked to the front of the Navigator, and laid out her driver's license and the car's registration certificate on the cool metal of the hood. Officer Finch approached cautiously, keeping an eye on Samuel, while Reed picked up the documents. He looked at Maya's driver's license first, his eyes scanning the name, Maya Jones, and the address, 217 Sycamore Lane. He glanced from the photo on the ID to her face. It was a clear match. Then he picked up the registration. The name of the registered owner was also Maya Jones. The vehicle was a burgundy Lincoln Navigator. The license plate number matched the one on the car in front of him. The facts were simple, direct, and undeniable. There was no theft. There was no crime. There was only a father helping his daughter with a dead battery. Reed stood there for a long moment, the plastic card and piece of paper in his hand. A long, uncomfortable silence descended over the scene. He had arrived ready for a confrontation with a dangerous felon. Instead, he was faced with the mundane, incontrovertible proof of his own error. He looked over at Samuel, whose hands were still patiently raised, his expression unreadable. He looked at Maya, who was staring at him with undisguised contempt. Finally, he tossed the documents back onto the hood of the car. The gesture was dismissive, lacking any grace or apology. "All right," he said, his voice low and grudging. The fire of the confrontation had been doused by the cold water of reality, but the acrid smoke of resentment remained. He turned to Finch. "Looks like it's clear." For the officers, the truth was not a resolution to be welcomed, but a momentum-killing annoyance. The confirmation of the facts should have ended the encounter immediately, followed by a sincere apology for the aggressive approach and the unfounded accusations. That is what should have happened. It is not what occurred on Sycamore Lane. Officer Reed, his authority punctured by the simple truth, seemed to resent Samuel and Maya for being innocent. Their innocence had made his high-stakes tactical arrival look foolish, and he was not a man who handled feeling foolish well. He motioned for Samuel to lower his hands with a curt flick of his wrist. "All right, you can put your hands down," he said, his tone still carrying an edge of command, as if he were granting a temporary reprieve rather than admitting a profound mistake. He then turned his hardened gaze on Maya. "Next time you have car trouble, Miss Jones, you might want to consider calling a proper tow service. We have actual crimes to deal with in this city. This whole situation has been a waste of departmental resources." The audacity of the statement was breathtaking. He was blaming them for being harassed. He was scolding the victims for the disturbance created by their false accusers and his own department's aggressive response. A waste of resources? Maya shot back, her voice trembling with rage. You're the ones who flew in here like you were raiding a drug den. We didn't call you. Someone lied to you, and you didn't even bother to ask a single intelligent question before treating my father like a suspect. You should be apologizing to him. Watch your tone, young lady, Officer Finch warned, stepping forward. We're just doing our job based on the information we were given. You're lucky things didn't get more complicated. The veiled threat was clear. Be grateful we didn't arrest you first and ask questions later. Samuel placed a calming hand on his daughter's arm. He knew there was nothing to be gained by arguing further. He could see it in their eyes. They were incapable of admitting fault. To them, they had been the ones in control, and they would be the ones to end the encounter on their terms. An apology was a surrender of that control, and they would not grant it. We understand, officers. Thank you for your time, Samuel said, his voice devoid of any warmth. It was a statement of dismissal, a signal that the conversation was over. Reed gave him a final, lingering look of suspicion before turning away. Let's go, Finch. The two officers walked back to their cruiser without another word. They didn't speak to Chad and Brittany, who were still watching from their window, their faces a canvas of confusion and disappointment. The dramatic crime they had reported had fizzled into a mundane domestic reality. The officers got into their car, the doors shutting with a solid thud. The engine started, and without a backward glance, the cruiser pulled away, the flashing lights now extinguished. The silence that descended in its wake was heavier and more oppressive than the silence that had preceded it. Samuel and Maya stood by the car, the jumper cables still connecting the two vehicles like an umbilical cord. The simple, frustrating task of fixing the battery now seemed insignificant, overshadowed by the ugliness of what had just transpired. The beautiful Saturday morning had been stained. "Dad, I'm so sorry," Maya said, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't believe that just happened." Samuel picked up the registration and license from the hood and handed them back to her. He looked at her, his expression weary but firm. "Don't you be sorry for a thing," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You did nothing wrong. Remember that." He then turned his gaze toward the house across the street, his eyes locking for a brief moment on the window where he could just make out two silhouettes before they quickly moved away. An apology remained unspoken, but an injustice had been clearly delivered. And Samuel Jones was not a man who forgot an injustice. A month can be both a lifetime and the blink of an eye. For Chad and Brittany Caldwell, the incident on Sycamore Lane faded quickly into the background noise of their comfortable lives. They recounted the story once or twice at dinner parties, framing it as a moment of high drama where their neighborhood vigilance had been misinterpreted. In their telling, they were the victims of an overreaction, good citizens whose intentions were noble. They felt no remorse, only a slight annoyance that the situation hadn't resolved with the validating neatness of an arrest. They saw Maya and her burgundy navigator coming and going, and they felt a prickle of resentment, as if the Jones family's very presence was a quiet rebuke. They remained secure in their righteousness, wrapped in the protective blanket of their wealth and privilege. For Samuel and Maya, the month was different. The echoes of that morning lingered. The memory of the officers' hostile voices, the feeling of being judged and condemned by unseen neighbors, the bitter taste of humiliation. These things did not simply vanish. It became a topic of conversation between them, a touchstone for a painful reality. "I still can't get over the fact that they blamed us for wasting their time," Maya said one evening, sitting with her father on the back patio of his comfortable, unpretentious home in a different part of the city. "When you can't admit you're wrong, you have to make the other person the problem," Samuel replied, swirling the ice in his glass of iced tea. "It's the oldest trick in the book of authority." He had seen it 1,000 times in his career, from 1,000 different angles. What Maya didn't know was that her father was engaged in a quiet, intense period of preparation. His days were filled with meetings, policy reviews, and long phone calls with city officials. He spent his evenings not relaxing, but studying, poring over budget reports, crime statistics, and personnel files from the very police department whose officers had treated him with such contempt. He was a man preparing to take command of a new army, learning the terrain and identifying the weaknesses before the first battle was even announced. He never spoke of this to Maya in detail, only saying he was wrapping up a long-term consulting project. The truth was, he had been courted for months, selected after a nationwide search to be the outsider, the reformer, the man who could bring change to a department plagued by years of scandals and community mistrust. The incident on Sycamore Lane had not been part of the plan, but it had served as a stark, personal confirmation of the necessity of his new, unstated role. He had thought about that morning often. He replayed the condescending tone of Officer Reed, the nervous aggression of Officer Finch. He had memorized their names from their name tags. He had looked them up. He knew their service records. He knew Reed had a pattern of citizen complaints, all dismissed. He knew Finch was a rookie. He saw them not as monstrous individuals, but as products of a deficient culture. A culture that fostered suspicion over curiosity and valued control over communication. The system hadn't just failed him. The system was working exactly as it was designed, and he was coming to redesign it from the ground up. He felt no burning need for personal revenge. His purpose was larger than that. What he felt was a profound, ice-cold resolve. The month passed, and the quiet father who had been working on a car on Sycamore Lane was ready to step into the light. The press conference was held in the formal, wood-paneled media room at City Hall. It was a major civic event, broadcast live on all the local news channels and streamed online. The city had been without a permanent chief of police for 6 months, following the contentious retirement of the last one, and the announcement of a successor was a moment of great anticipation and political significance. Mayor Thompson, a politician with a practiced, reassuring smile, stood at a podium adorned with the city seal. In their living room on Sycamore Lane, Chad and Brittany were watching, though with only partial attention. The television was on, a familiar backdrop to their evening routine. Chad was scrolling through stock market updates on his laptop, while Brittany was planning a weekend trip to a vineyard. After a rigorous nationwide search, Mayor Thompson was saying, his voice resonating with importance, we sought a candidate with not only unimpeachable qualifications and extensive experience, but a leader with a clear vision for the future of community-based constitutional policing. We sought a reformer, and we found one. Brittany glanced up at the screen, a flicker of civic interest crossing her face. Oh, they're finally announcing the new chief. I wonder who it will be. Probably some insider from the department, same as always, Chad grunted without looking up from his screen. This leader, the mayor continued, has a decorated 30-year career in law enforcement, rising through the ranks and most recently serving as deputy commissioner in a major metropolitan department known for its groundbreaking reform initiatives. He is a man who understands that trust between the community and its police force is the bedrock of public safety. It is my distinct honor to introduce to you the next chief of police for our great city. The mayor paused for dramatic effect, turning to his side. Chief Samuel Jones. As the name was spoken, a man stepped out from the wings and walked toward the podium. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed in a perfectly tailored dark navy suit. He moved with a quiet, powerful confidence. Brittany's wine glass, which she had been raising to her lips, stopped mid-air. Her eyes widened, the color draining from her face. Chad, sensing the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere, finally looked up from his laptop. His mouth fell slightly open. The man on the screen, the man being lauded by the mayor, the man who was now shaking hands with city council members as cameras flashed around him, was not a stranger. It was him. The man in the blue jumpsuit, the man they had reported for stealing a car, the man whose presence in their neighborhood had so offended their sense of order. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The blood pounded in Brittany's ears, a frantic roaring sound that drowned out the television. The face of the man on the screen filled her vision, calm, composed, authoritative. She saw him not as he was now, in a suit, but as he was then, in a jumpsuit, his hands raised in a posture of surrender. She remembered the words she had spoken to the 911 dispatcher, aggressive, yelling, possibly armed. The memory, once a source of pride, was now a source of pure, unadulterated terror. "No," Chad whispered, the single word a breath of disbelief. "It can't be." But it was. The press conference continued. Chief Samuel Jones stepped to the podium to give his remarks, his voice the same calm, steady baritone they had heard on that Saturday morning. But now, that voice carried the full weight and authority of the city's entire law enforcement apparatus. For Chad and Brittany, the revelation was not just a shock, it was a cataclysm. The fortress they had built around their lives had just been breached, not by a criminal, but by the very man they had tried to turn into one. And he was now the most powerful police officer in the city. The immediate aftermath of the revelation was a silent, suffocating panic inside the Caldwell home. The television continued to broadcast the press conference, but Chad and Brittany no longer heard the words. They just stared at the screen, at the face of Chief Samuel Jones, their minds racing to catch up with the new, terrifying reality. The smug certainty that had defined their lives had evaporated in an instant, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. "Turn it off!" Brittany finally choked out, her voice a strangled whisper. "Chad, turn it off!" Chad fumbled for the remote, his hands trembling slightly, and the screen went black, plunging the room into a sudden, heavy silence. They stood there, two figures frozen in their perfect, minimalist living room, the world they had so carefully constructed now feeling like a fragile glass house. "What are we going to do?" Brittany asked, wrapping her arms around herself as if a sudden chill had swept through the room. "He knows. He has to know it was us who called." "How would he know?" Chad shot back, his voice sharp with denial, but his face was pale. "It was an anonymous call, a concerned neighbor." "Anonymous? We gave our address!" she cried, her composure shattering. "And they came! They talked to us!" "No, they didn't, did they? They just talked to him. But he saw us! He looked right at the house!" The memory of Samuel's final, lingering gaze toward their window on that morning returned to them both with chilling clarity. It hadn't been an idle glance. It had been an act of identification. Chad began to pace the length of the living room, his mind, usually so adept at calculating business risks, now struggling to process this personal and profound miscalculation. Okay, let's think. He's the chief of police. He's a public figure. He can't just come after us. That would be an abuse of power. There are rules. "We accused him of being a car thief!" Brittany shrieked, the hysteria bubbling to the surface. "We told the dispatcher he was aggressive and armed. We lied, Chad. What if they recorded the call? They record those calls. What if he listens to it? He's the chief. He can get anything he wants. He'll hear my voice." The phone on the coffee table buzzed. It was a notification from the neighborhood group chat. Brittany's hand trembled as she picked it up. Mark, the neighbor who had validated their suspicions, had sent a message to the group. "Is everyone watching the news right now? You are not going to believe who the new police chief is." The screen lit up with a flurry of replies, question marks, exclamations of shock, and then a message from Susan 2 doors down. "Wait, was that the man from Maya's house that day? The one someone called the cops on?" The secret was no longer contained within their own 4 walls. The story was re-emerging, and this time the narrative was completely outside of their control. They were no longer the vigilant neighbors. They were the people who had falsely accused the new chief of police. The collapse of their certainty was total. The fortress of Crestwood Hills suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage of their own making. And they had just realized the man holding the key was the one they had tried to lock up. The story did not just leak, it erupted. Within 48 hours of the press conference, an enterprising local news reporter, tipped off by the buzz in the Crestwood Hills community, connected the dots. The human interest story about the new chief's quiet life was suddenly supplanted by a much more explosive one. The headline on the news station's website read, "New police chief was subject of suspicious person call in wealthy neighborhood just 1 month before appointment." The article was cautious, citing unnamed sources, but the details were unmistakable. A black man, a luxury SUV, a 911 call from a neighbor, a police response. The story went viral locally. The city's social media channels lit up with questions and outrage. The incident was no longer a private humiliation for the Jones family or a secret shame for the Caldwells. It was a public scandal, and the city's new police chief was at the center of it. For Chief Samuel Jones, the media attention was an unwelcome but necessary catalyst. He knew the incident could not be swept under the rug. To ignore it would be to betray the very principles of transparency and accountability he had been hired to instill. He made a single phone call to the mayor, informing him of the full, unvarnished truth of what had happened that day. Then he did something unprecedented. He formally requested that the Office of Professional Standards, the department's Internal Affairs Division, open a full and transparent investigation into the conduct of the responding officers on the day in question. He, the chief of police, was officially filing a complaint against his own officers. The investigation, under the direct order of the chief, moved with lightning speed. The first and most critical pieces of evidence were the body camera videos from officers Reed and Finch. Captain Wells, the seasoned and notoriously thorough head of internal affairs, watched the footage with 2 of his top investigators. The video was damning. Reed's camera captured his immediate hostile approach, his dismissive tone, and his utter failure to engage in basic fact-finding police work. The investigators noted his condescending lecture to Maya and Samuel at the end, a clear abuse of his authority. Finch's camera was even more revealing. It caught his snide remarks to Reed, his eagerness to escalate, and his leading questions designed to confirm his bias rather than uncover the truth. The footage showed 2 officers who had arrived at a conclusion long before they arrived on the scene. Next, Wells pulled the recording of the 911 call. They listened as Brittany Caldwell's frantic, deceptive voice filled the soundproofed room. They transcribed her claims, aggressive, yelling, might have a weapon, and cross-referenced them with the body camera footage. The video showed Samuel Jones speaking in a calm, measured tone throughout. It showed his hands were always visible. It showed he was holding a wire brush, not a weapon. The disparity wasn't just a misinterpretation, it was a fabrication, and it had created the conditions for a potentially lethal encounter. The personnel files for Reed and Finch were pulled. As Jones already knew, Reed's file was thick with citizen complaints alleging racial bias and excessive force, each one closed as unsubstantiated. Wells, looking at them now in the context of this new, undeniable evidence, saw a clear, disturbing pattern that had been willfully ignored by past leadership. The system hadn't just failed on Sycamore Lane, it had been failing for years, and Officer Reed was a symptom of that systemic failure. The unblinking eye of accountability was now wide open, and for Officers Reed and Finch, there was nowhere left to hide. A week after the story broke, Chief Jones made a decision that sent ripples through both the police department and the city's elite. He announced he would be personally attending the previously scheduled Crestwood Hills Neighborhood Association's quarterly meeting. The meeting, usually a dull affair focused on landscaping violations and plans for the annual holiday party, was suddenly the most anticipated event in town. It was to be held in the clubhouse of the neighborhood's private golf course, a bastion of the very exclusivity that had caused the incident in the first place. When Chief Jones arrived, the room was packed. News cameras were lined up in the back. The residents of Crestwood Hills, who usually sent a single representative from each household, were there in force. Among them, seated near the middle of the room, were Chad and Brittany Caldwell. They looked pale and tense, trapped between the social obligation to appear and the profound desire to be anywhere else on Earth. Chief Jones, in his crisp, dark blue uniform, stood at the front of the room. He didn't use the podium. He stood before them directly, creating a sense of intimacy and directness that was both commanding and disarming. He began by speaking about his vision for the department, about building trust and fostering partnerships. Then, he paused. "I also know," he said, his calm voice filling the silent room, "that there are questions about a recent incident involving me, personally, that took place right here in this neighborhood. I want to address that directly, because transparency starts at the top." A nervous hush fell over the crowd. Chad stared at the floor. Brittany looked as if she might faint. "About 5 weeks ago, on a Saturday morning, I was on Sycamore Lane helping my daughter with her stalled car," the chief began, recounting the events with a calm, factual precision. He described the battery issue, the jumper cables, the work he was doing. He didn't use inflammatory language, he simply told the truth. While we were working, a 911 call was placed. The caller reported that a suspicious man was trying to steal the vehicle, that he was aggressive and possibly armed. He let those words hang in the air. 2 officers responded, and based on that false information, they treated me not as a citizen in need of help, or even as a person to be questioned, but as an imminent threat. The situation de-escalated only when my daughter was able to provide proof of ownership. He then looked out at the faces in the crowd, his gaze sweeping across the room before it settled, just for a moment, on Chad and Brittany. Their eyes met his. In his gaze, there was no overt anger, no malice. There was something far more powerful, a profound and unshakable disappointment. It was the look of a leader holding a mirror up to the community he was now sworn to protect, forcing them to see an ugly reflection. "The issue here," he concluded, his voice resonating with authority, "is not just about me. I have the benefit of a title. The question we all have to ask is, what would have happened on that morning if I hadn't been the chief of police? What if I were just another father in another neighborhood? That is the question that my department and I will be working every single day to answer, to ensure that everyone in this city receives fair, impartial, and respectful justice. Not just the people who live in neighborhoods like this, but everyone." The power dynamic, once so cruelly inverted on that Saturday morning, was now irrevocably, publicly, and completely restored. The accusers, who had hidden behind their windows and their phones, were now face to face with the man they had wronged, and they had nowhere to hide. The town hall meeting was a turning point. It transformed the incident from a media story into a moment of public reckoning. The pressure on the city and the police department to act decisively became immense. Chief Jones had laid down the gauntlet, and now the system had to respond. The internal affairs investigation into officers Reed and Finch concluded a week later. The findings, supported by the undeniable body camera footage and the 911 recording, were damning. They were found to have violated multiple department policies, including failure to conduct a proper preliminary investigation, unprofessional conduct, and abuse of authority. The report cited their immediate escalation of the situation based on a biased, uncorroborated report, and their subsequent failure to de-escalate even after the situation was clarified. They hadn't just made a mistake, they had demonstrated a fundamental unsuitability for police work. Chief Jones reviewed the report and the recommendations from Captain Wells. There was no hesitation. Both Officer Reed and Officer Finch were served with termination notices. The police union immediately filed a grievance, as was standard procedure, but it was a token effort. The evidence was too overwhelming, the political will for their removal too strong. Their careers in law enforcement were over. The message sent through the entire department was clear and unequivocal. The old way of doing business, of policing based on assumption and prejudice, would no longer be tolerated. For Chad and Brittany Caldwell, the fallout was more social and legal. In the wake of the town hall, they became pariahs in their own neighborhood. The whispers and sideways glances were constant. They were the couple who had brought shame and negative media attention to the pristine enclave of Crestwood Hills. Their vigilance was now seen for what it was: reckless prejudice. Their lawyer, seeing the writing on the wall and the potential for a civil lawsuit from Chief Jones, advised them to get ahead of the story. He brokered a meeting with the city attorney's office. While criminal charges for filing a false report were a possibility, the city was more interested in a public resolution that would demonstrate accountability and begin to heal the rift. The result was a formal, written public apology, which was a condition to avoid potential prosecution. The letter, drafted by their lawyer but signed by them, was published in the Sunday edition of the city's main newspaper. It was a humiliating document, filled with stilted, legalistic expressions of deep regret for the misunderstanding. They admitted their assumptions were wrong and apologized for the distress their actions caused to Chief Jones and his family. For Samuel, the apology was a necessary formality, but it was not the true resolution. The firings were a step towards accountability, but they were not the solution. These were merely the consequences, the price paid for a profound failure. The real work, the work he had been hired to do, was in changing the system that had allowed that morning to happen in the first place. The firings closed a chapter on the incident itself, but for Chief Jones, the larger story of reform was just beginning. The price of prejudice had been paid by the individuals involved, but the work of rooting it out from the institution was a far greater and more enduring challenge. The lights of the city spread out below Chief Samuel Jones's office window like a galaxy of fallen stars. It was late, long after the hum of the day's bureaucracy had faded into the quiet hum of the building's ventilation. The setting sun had painted the sky in deep hues of purple and orange, a tranquil beauty that stood in stark contrast to the complexities of the world below. His office was still new to him, the leather of his chair barely broken in, the walls adorned with commendations and photographs that traced the long arc of his career. But it was the view of the city, his city now, that held his attention. He saw not just buildings and streets, but a sprawling, intricate network of human lives he was now sworn to protect. He thought back to that Saturday on Sycamore Lane. The memory no longer sparked with the sharp, immediate sting of anger or humiliation. Instead, it had settled into something heavier, more contemplative. It had become a diagnostic tool, a case study not in his own victimization, but in the fragility of justice itself. He didn't see Reed and Finch as monsters, but as men who were the inevitable product of a system that had failed to teach them better, that had, in fact, rewarded their cynicism and their shortcuts. He saw Chad and Brittany not as cartoon villains, but as people so insulated by their privilege that their empathy had atrophied, replaced by a fear of anything that disrupted their curated world. Their actions were a failure of character, yes, but also a failure of community. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly in the quiet room. He picked up a framed photo from his desk. It was of him and a younger Maya, both beaming, standing next to that same burgundy Navigator when it was brand new, a gift for her graduation. A father's pride. That's all he had been on that day. A father, proud of his daughter doing what fathers do. And for that, he had been transformed into a threat. The termination of the officers and the public apology from the Caldwells were necessary acts of accountability, but they felt like treating the symptoms of a much deeper illness. The real work lay ahead, in the tedious, unglamorous, and absolutely essential tasks of rewriting policy, redesigning training, and fundamentally changing the culture of the department from one of a warrior to one of a guardian. That morning had given him not a grudge, but a mandate. It had taken his professional mission and made it profoundly personal. The city lights twinkled, each one a home, a life, a story, and he felt the immense, crushing weight and the profound honor of his duty to protect them all. The human mind is a powerful, flawed, and often lazy machine. It loves shortcuts, and the easiest shortcut is the stereotype. What truly drove Chad and Brittany was not overt hatred, but a deep-seated, unexamined belief in a particular world order. In their world, a black man in a jumpsuit beside a luxury car was an error in the matrix, a piece of data that didn't compute with their established patterns. Their 911 call was an attempt to force reality to conform to their expectations, to restore the order they felt had been violated. Their fear, amplified by the echo chamber of their exclusive community, gave them permission to abandon logic and embrace the simple, ugly comfort of prejudice. We must ask the difficult, what-if questions to truly understand the razor's edge upon which that morning was balanced. What if Samuel Jones had not spent 3 decades honing an almost inhuman level of self-control? What if he had reacted with the righteous anger any citizen would feel, raising his voice, gesturing in frustration? The officers arrived primed for a fight, and he would have given them the justification they were subconsciously seeking. A single misstep could have turned him from a victim of harassment into a resisting suspect with potentially tragic consequences. What if Maya hadn't been there? What if the registration hadn't been in the car? The narrative would have been the word of 2 officers and 2 concerned citizens against his. It is a battle very few men who look like him win. The ultimate lesson here is not simply that prejudice is wrong. It is that accountability is the only antidote. The story found a resolution because of an extraordinary circumstance, the victim's hidden identity. But justice should not depend on a plot twist. It must be built into the very fabric of our systems. It reminds us that integrity is not for the easy days, but for the difficult ones. It is the courage of a supervisor to seek the truth, and the resolve of a leader to use a personal injustice as a catalyst for systemic change. It teaches us that the fight against our worst instincts is won not in grand pronouncements, but in the difficult, moment-to-moment choices we make every day. The choice to question our own assumptions and to demand accountability when we see an injustice. This story found its conclusion, but countless others do not, ending not with a press conference, but with a tragedy. It begs us to consider what we would have done in that situation. Would we have been the one to speak up and question the narrative? Or would we have simply closed our curtains and walked away? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. How do we build communities where empathy outweighs suspicion? Your voice is crucial in keeping these vital conversations going.